Hey everyone, welcome back to Atlanta DSA's reading of Class Struggle Unionism by Joe Burns. Um, so we've covered chapters 1 and 2, Shop Floor Economics and Class Struggle Union Ideas in our first book club session. Then the next one we covered chapters 3, Beyond Labor Liberalism, and chapters 4, Class Struggle Unionists Fight for the Entire Working Class. If you missed those book club meetings, we have videos similar to the one you're watching now on those two sessions. So just go back and watch those to catch up if you'd like. This is on chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5 is called Class Struggle Tactics, and chapter 6 is Class Struggle Organizing, Rank and File Unionism, and the Militant Minority. Now, we covered chapter 5 in whole, and we covered part of chapter 6. We'll cover the next part of chapter 6 next time. But yeah, before we get into the questions, I'd like to just go over some of the topics and points that were discussed in the book club. So obviously the big one is that the railroad strike was killed by Congress. It was signed by Joe Biden, so you got both Congress and the president saying no to the railroad strikers or the railroad workers that want to go on strike. So, of course, we talked about that a lot. We also mentioned a topic that was covered in the previous session, which was the fact that a lot of activity of organized labor, such as certain types of protests, strikes, sit-ins, lockouts, whatever, have been made illegal. However, somebody brought up the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Right-wingers did that. That's illegal, obviously. Civil rights leaders in the 50s and 60s used to do sit-ins and lockouts. Even though those are illegal, you will be arrested for doing that, especially if you do it by yourself. But the question is, why can't we do that kind of stuff now? Also, what's the difference between what civil rights leaders and activists were doing, breaking the law in the 50s and 60s, versus what right-wingers were doing on January 6th? And the difference is that there's different intentions. One of those groups is trying to suspend the rules of democracy so that their preferred god, king, emperor can rule forever. And the other one is trying to improve living conditions for ethnic minorities. So obviously there's hugely different intentions there. We also, since this is, the Atlanta DSA, we're in Georgia, we brought up right to work. Said it was one of the worst things. People who want better lives for themselves essentially are able to get fired for no reason. That's what right to work means, but they use this like George Orwell style phrasing to make it sound like it's a good thing, but obviously it's not. We also discussed ways that bosses typically react to striking workers. In the American history, bosses have literally gotten away with killing strikers. Of course, we have the beloved Pinkerton Detective Agency. They keep coming up when it comes to labor history, which says a lot. But it's not just in ancient American history from 100 or 200 years ago. This is also recent. Somebody brought up that at either a General Mills or Kellogg's factory, one of the bosses tried running over workers in his pickup truck. And this is not something that happened a long time ago. This was very recent, like within the last couple of years or so. We also discussed certain tactic called secondary strikes. We said that secondary strikes are likely stronger than primary strikes because secondary strike is a way of showing solidarity. It's a way of amplifying the pressure of the primary strike so that it's not it's not just one strike, it's two strikes. Two strikes are better than one, right? Um, we discussed how do we boost public support for strikes? Because sometimes, especially in the case of like a railroad strike or a bunch of grocery store workers going on strike, it might not be popular because people aren't going to get their customer goods or their groceries or food, right? So, one thing that we discussed is what if the workers at those places provide services for free instead of, just walking off the job? They keep doing the job, but they just don't collect any money. Um, so this way, the strike doesn't impact public access or infrastructure access to goods. This is something that the Australian rail strikers were able to do. You just refuse to accept payment for goods and services. So if you're manning the cash register, you just tell them it's on the house, don't pay. This will boost public support for the strike because, well, A, they're getting stuff for free. B, they're not being impacted negatively by the strike. Um, and C, they're able to have like this sort of connection with the worker that gives them the free goods or service. Something else that we talked about was corporate entities in Georgia. They control public sector policies and regulations. They're not done. These policies and regulations aren't being decided on publicly. It's just a bunch of shadowy corporate entities. Um, we also said that most of us personally haven't gone on strike ourselves. I've been to a strike, but I haven't actually walked out of my job. Um, Someone mentioned the phones down scene from the movie Sorry to Bother You. Good example of a work stoppage. Another tactic that was discussed is work to rule, which is only do what's strictly written down in your contract. If somebody asks you to do something else, you simply point to your job description and say, I'm sorry, that's not here. That's not my responsibility. Talk to somebody else. If it says something in your contract, you do exactly what it says down to the you know, down to the letter, down to the dots on the I's and the crosses on the T's, and you don't do anything else. You do exactly what it says, even if your boss meant for you to do something else, but, wasn't skilled enough in legal speak to write a more binding contract. Um, Somebody brought up the Trump taxes. It was postponed by 3 years by one single judge in Florida. So those taxes should have come out a long time ago, but they weren't because of one guy. This is a good example of a slowdown as opposed to a stoppage. Um, Somebody brought up a kind of a gender strike in Finland. Basically, in the 70s, almost all the women in the entire country didn't show up to work, and the strike didn't last long because the uh, employers basically caved immediately. They realized, oh, the whole country is going to grind to a halt if these women aren't working. Just give them everything they want. We moved on to about 10, 11, 12 years ago, the Occupy movement. This is where people are starting to get a little bit more risky. They're starting to take more chances, do things that are actually illegal. And I brought up around that time, there was a bunch of activists in Cleveland that were participating in the Stop Cop City protests. That's happening in the Atlanta area, but a bunch of activists in Cleveland basically walked into the office of the contractor that was hired to clear this forest to build Cop City and basically just like blew trumpets and spread some like glitter around and made a bit of a ruckus, right? So the office workers weren't able to do anything that day, so work was stopped. We also brought up the recent Just Stop Oil activists, and we compared that to the guy who set himself on fire earlier this year at the Supreme Court to protest climate change. We said one of these got more media attention, the Just Stop Oil. Okay, I already hit 10 minutes, so I gotta get through the rest of these points really quick. So I was talking about how you would think a guy setting himself on fire would get a whole bunch of media attention, especially if he does it outside the Supreme Court, but it barely got a mention in the press. Uh, Whereas the Just Stop Oil activists, the people that are throwing like soup on European paintings in museums and stuff, don't worry, the paintings are fine. They're like covered by a sheet of glass, so none of them are actually ruined, at least to my knowledge. But those guys got a lot of media attention for that, and we pointed out that this means that we have to sort of engineer our tactics to A, get media attention, B, hopefully not get any of us injured or killed, and C, get the public to support what we're doing. Whereas, the Just Stop Oil was campaign was heavily criticized by people that like paintings, and the guy setting himself on fire. Well, there wasn't much public support or opposition because barely anybody even knew that happened. The next topic that we talked about was workplace-based solidarity. Why is this super important? Well, one thing is it prevents scabs. If there's solidarity among the working class, you're not going to see scabs crossing the picket line because everyone's going to be locked down, arm in arm, in solidarity with each other. And then the last thing that we talked about was the right to coerce others in labor theory. Do we have a right to coerce other people to do what we want them to do? And the answer to this question is yes, we do. How do we justify it? Well, one person mentioned the common welfare. If we're able to get our demands met, we could maybe, I don't know, stop climate change. We could improve the infrastructure of the city. We could get ourselves, not just ourselves, but also all of our fellow workers, better wages and benefits. So obviously, this would be beneficial for common welfare. Another person mentions that capitalism, well, specifically like the economics classes that teach capitalism, like Econ 101, macroeconomics, shit like that. It doesn't even work on paper, let alone in practice. It doesn't even get that far, does it? Because it's fundamentally based on a bunch of premises that aren't true, like that human beings are informed agents making rational decisions. It's obviously not true. Just talk to somebody. They're not informed, and they're not an informed agent, and they're not making rational decisions. And then one person said another way of justifying the right to coerce others is, well, democracy. If the majority says we should do something, that's the thing that we should be doing. Because if you're not following majority rule, then you're necessarily following minority rule. So you have to make a choice. Which is it? Are you going to follow the majority rule, or are you going to follow the minority rule? Because you can't do both, and you can't do neither. You have to pick one. And yeah, that's basically covers the entire discussion from this book club. So now let's get into the discussion questions. Okay, let's get into these discussion questions. So the first one is, why does Burns say we simply cannot win within the framework of existing labor law? Well, we could take a look at current events. As I mentioned earlier, there was a rail worker strike that's nearly happened until Congress passed a bill and Joe Biden signed it and basically said, hey, you're not allowed to strike. Strikes are illegal. You're not allowed to walk off the job, especially before the holiday season. And the reason is because rail workers don't have sick leave. They don't have paid sick leave. And that's what they were after. And they didn't get the paid sick leave that they wanted. So we could not only look at the United States, we could also look at what's going on in England, because in England, the rail workers are actually on strike right now. It wasn't just, oh, the government said you're not allowed to do this. No, they're on strike. And there's this article in the Financial Times here, which says, and I quote, "The alternative is staring us in the face, nationalize. The London North Eastern Railway, which runs east from King's Cross, has operated in a normal timetable post-pandemic since being taken over by the government. Labour has promised to bring the railways into public ownership when the contracts expire in the next few years." So that's what the Labour Party wants. They want to bring the railways into public ownership. Um, and we've seen from uh, basically just looking at pre-pandemic when it wasn't uh, taken over by the government and post-pandemic when it was, we've seen that the trains simply run better when it's owned by the government. They just run more efficiently. That's just, you can take a look at that and you can say it's a sort of scientific analysis of this, but you can just come to your own conclusions about that. But going back to the question, what's wrong with the framework of existing labor law? The reason is that we can't win in that framework is it's because of this. If you want to design a framework, whether it's a legal framework or any other framework, to perform a certain function, and you optimize it for performing that function, you could typically have a really good framework. The problem is labor law was not designed with the purpose of protecting laborers. It's not designed to protect the workers' interests. It's designed to protect capital. It's designed to protect the bosses, the bourgeoisie. So that's why when labor laws get passed, it's usually shit like right to work, saying, hey, workers, you're not allowed to go on strike. And if you talk about unionization, your employer can just fire you for no reason. They don't have to list a reason why they're firing you, they just fire you. So that's the reality of labor law. It's designed to punish workers for acting out of line and reward bosses, basically just reward bosses for being bosses. If you want to learn more about this, Joe Burns has another book called Strike Back, which you can see here on the screen, rediscovering militant tactics to fight the attack on public employee unions. I believe this was written sometime after 2011 when the teachers in Wisconsin went on strike, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the context of this. But moving on to the next question. What does the author mean by a movement capable of violating labor law and a rejection of employer property rights? So we'll start with the first quote, a movement capable of violating labor law. So labor law was, as I mentioned, set up to restrict the ability of organized labor to enact any kind of change or put pressure on the bosses and whatever. Meaning, logically speaking, if you want to put pressure on bosses, you have to violate some labor law. You have to be willing to do things like sit-ins or lockouts or picket lines and shit like that, which are illegal. I'm pretty sure, like, picket lines and sit-ins specifically, those are considered trespassing. And you'll be arrested and thrown in prison for trespassing, especially if you do it by yourself. If you're with a whole bunch of other people, maybe they don't have enough cops. Now, that's why you need to be willing to violate labor law. You need to be capable of it in order to actually get something done. And this next part, a rejection of employer property rights. Well, employer property rights is taken as a given under capitalism. People say, of course they have property rights. Why wouldn't they? They're the employer. They're, supposed to have property rights, so to speak. But we need to ask ourselves the question, where do these rights come from, and why should the employer have these property rights? Um, because if you analyze capitalism along a Marxist framework, you'll realize that all private property is theft. Actually, I think that's more of an anarchist phrase than a Marxist one specifically. But I mean, the idea still works. In order for there to be private property, somebody had to steal that property from somebody else. I mean, you could take a look at the Anglo-Saxons coming to America and just claiming all the land for themselves, as well as the Spanish. But they got most of South America, and then the Portuguese got the rest, and then the English got what's now known as the United States and Canada. After France had Canada for a while, but that's complicated American history. Um, Obviously, all of that land was stolen from the American Indians. Um, and you could trace the similar pattern to all of Europe with like what I'm trying to remember the name of this, like the fenced in movement, where after the agricultural revolution, a bunch of landowners decided to put up a bunch of fences and kick all of the people that used to live on that land, the peasantry and whatnot, off of the land. So now they're basically homeless, and a small group of landowners now own everything. And all of this is because of the notion of property rights and private property rights specifically. So if we reject these notions of property rights, of an employer having property rights over the machines in the factory or the factory itself or the office space or whatnot, that frees you from being it frees you from uh, having to obey a social contract that you didn't necessarily buy into. Um, so that's basically why it's important to reject employer property rights. Okay, next question that we have is, what are the key elements needed to win a strike in the private sector? So the private sector, as opposed to the public sector, you essentially need to do three things. And without these three things, you can't have any sort of uh, any sort of strike. So you need to stop the input of goods and services into the factory or the workplace or whatever. Second thing is you need to stop the work process. And the third thing is you need to prevent the distribution of goods and services. Now, you need you need to keep all three of these things in mind, but depending on the industry that you're working in, some of them might not apply. Like, I'm pretty sure stopping the work process applies anywhere, but preventing stopping the input of goods or services might not be too important if you're working in tech and the goods and services that you're importing are software, because I mean, it's it's pretty hard to stop somebody from getting a certain piece of software on their computer. Maybe you could do something with the firewall. Maybe you could, I don't know, but it's it's a bit less feasible in my opinion. But that's just me. Um, we have an example over here, the UPS worker strike of 1997. This was a Teamsters-led strike. So it was the largest strike of the 1990s. And they wanted part-time jobs turned into full-time work, higher wages, safeguards for their multi-employer pension plans. And public support for the strike was high. And because of the fact that 185,000 people were part of the strike, their demands were granted. Um, and yeah, they basically got everything they wanted. Um, so that's covers how to strike in the private sector. You need to stop goods and services from coming into the workplace, like the raw materials. You need to stop the work process, and you need to stop the distribution of goods and services. The goods moving out of the workplace and being sent to some store or a supermarket or whatever. Next question. Why does Burns say that public employee strikes are fundamentally political as opposed to the private sector strikes? So, the reason why public employee strikes are fundamentally political is, I mean, you can take a look at the U.S. postal strike of 1970, which we got over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Um, the workers had low wages, but the workers perceived as low wages. You gotta love Investopedia, right? Um, so the workers were getting low wages. They had terrible working conditions. They had meager benefits, um, and this was at a time when collective bargaining by U.S. postal workers was banned, kind of like how railroad striking is banned. But they ignored the ban. They refused to end the strike, and people were not able to have their mail delivered. The Nixon administration sent in the National Guard to deliver the mail. It didn't work, and 2 weeks later, they started negotiating. The strikers' demands were met. They had an 8% raise, and they also regained the right to bargain and negotiate. Um, so that's kind of the difference between that strike and from the previous slide, the UPS worker strike. One of them was public sector, the other one is private sector. The U.S. postal strike of 1970, that's public sector. Um, it was fundamentally political because the president got involved. He sent in the National Guard um, to try to, break the strike, to try to act as scabs, basically. Now, this is also covered in Strike Back, Joe Burns' other book. Um, if you look at this quote here in the middle, it says, strikes were illegal in every jurisdiction in the United States until the late 1960s. Yet public employees engaged in one of the biggest waves of civil disobedience to win their unions. Millions of teachers, sanitation workers, and others successfully violated labor law to win strikes during this period. It was illegal to strike, but they did it anyway because they wanted their unions, and you know what? It ended up working. So, moving on now to more specifics, what are the key ways to stop the input of goods and services? Now, we have a handy list here. You can do mass picketing to physically block supplies from going into a plant, like blocking railroad tracks to stop coal from going into a plant. You could get truck drivers to honor picket lines, not in the limited way of today, but by completely stopping the delivery of goods. So just get the truck drivers to not cross the picket line, right? You could strike or blockade related businesses that supply the employer, um, kind of like how the Stop Cop City protesters in Ohio were able to halt the contractor office from being able to get any work done on that day. Then you can cut off capital to operate, which would require using secondary strikes or boycotts to go after banks and other funders. The point here is to cut off the lifeblood of the business. So all of the inputs that you need to run the business, you stop that, and the business basically gets choked out. Next question. What are the key methods to stop the work process? So all you got to do is prevent production. But I'm just reading through this quote here. So I'm going to start from the second paragraph. Workers could strike on the job or conduct quickie strikes in which they did not cede control of the workplace. The goal of these tactics is to stop the employer from operating the workplace. The key tactics involve a degree of coercion to prevent non-union or disloyal union workers from scabbing on the strike. If you go back earlier in the video when we were having I was going over what we discussed. We have some other tactics that we talked about. Work to rule, only doing what's strictly in your contracts. Work stoppage, like in the movie Sorry to Bother You, the phones down scene. If you haven't seen that, it's probably on YouTube. And if it's not, I'm sure Boots Riley would be okay with you pirating the movie. But if you want to buy it, buy it. It's on Hulu last time I checked. Now, the next question here, what are the traditional union ways to prevent the distribution of goods and services? And the traditional union ways is basically secondary strikes, in which the targets are merchants who sell, transport, or distribute the struck goods. I'm reading from this part on the top. The basic concept is if an employer produces goods or services but cannot sell, deliver, or perform them, then all of that work that they did before is for naught. So you have these three big questions here. What would happen if trucks stopped delivering? What products would be affected by rail strike? How does an airport impact the economy? There's a reason why air traffic control workers have a lot of power when it comes to organized labor disputes. It's because if they go on strike, that's basically it. No one's taking a plane off. No one's landing. You're basically, the entire economy is immediately stopped because people can't get from point A to point B. Goods can't be shipped. If the goods are being shipped by plane, and a lot of them are nowadays. So yeah, that's essentially how you stop the distribution of goods and services. You stop them from being sold or delivered. Okay, the next question is, why is workplace-based solidarity the final piece of winning strikes? We talked about in our discussion at the beginning of this video, if you have workplace-based solidarity, you're able to prevent scabs from crossing the picket line and doing the work. And if you take a look on the left-hand side here, this part from the book, you have tactics that are highlighted: secondary strikes, industry-wide strikes, and in exceedingly rare instances, localized general strikes. So what is a secondary strike? Well, a secondary strike is a strike in a related industry that tries to either stop goods and services that are inputs in the business process from coming in, or stop the goods and services from being delivered or sold or distributed after the work is done in the office or the workplace. So preventing the inputs and the outputs from happening. That's essentially what a secondary strike is. So let's say, for example, there's a grocery store. The grocery store sells food. Well, the food has usually already delivered to the grocery store. But what you can do is you can have one of the distributors of the food also go on strike. And if they go on strike, it'll put more pressure on the grocery store to give in to the demands of the grocery store workers. So an industry-wide strike is, it kind of says it on the tin. It's a strike that takes place over the entire industry. Instead of just one store, it's all of the stores, right? Instead of one company that does something, it's every single company that does something. Instead of, one railroad company, because the United States has several for some reason, it's every single railroad company. That's obviously going to have a much larger impact than if just one business's employees went on strike. So That's why workplace-based solidarity is important. It allows you to take the pressure of just a regular strike and magnify it, um, 1,000-fold, right? Um, Next question. What is a theory of labor rights that gives us the right to coerce others? Gonna quote from this part here. This sets up an irreconcilable conflict between liberal labor theory and militancy. After all, what gives us the right to coerce others? Um, so the next part of this basically covers elements of class struggle unionism. They need to reject billionaire control of the economy, promote intense class on class struggle, develop grassroots unionism rooted in the workplace, challenge the entire capitalist system, and establish a class wide form of unionism. So these things, they cannot be done by yourself. You're going to have to get other people to help you with doing things. And even then, you're going to encounter people that don't want you to do these things. They don't want you to be able to go on strike and get better pay and benefits and safer working conditions and, a less hostile work climate. Um, there are going to be people that want you to essentially live life like a serf, to have absolutely nothing to your name or have no power, no identity to speak of, basically just be a cog in the machine so that, the bourgeoisie can live lavish, luxurious lifestyles without having to lift a finger. Obviously, you're going to have to get some people to do things that they don't want to do in order to break this. And we mentioned earlier in our discussion 3 justifications for the right to coerce others: their common welfare, that capitalism doesn't even work on paper, let alone in practice, and democracy, either majority rule or minority rule, right? And I think you ask most people, they're going to prefer majority rule. Some people prefer minority rule, but there's, obvious reasons for that. Next question. What is the importance of the 2004 AFT proposal for creating new independent labor organizations? The 2004 AFT proposal, essentially what it is if you take a look at, for example, these quotes on the bottom. I'm going to read this one on the bottom right. What does labor want? It wants the earth and the fullness thereof. There is nothing too precious, there is nothing too beautiful, too lofty, too ennobling, unless it is within the scope and comprehension of labor's aspiration and wants. This is a quote from Samuel Gompers. He was asked, what does labor want? And that was his answer. So the proposal for creating new independent labor organizations is that the old ones aren't essentially able to reach certain workers or certain industries. Recently, there's high tech, there's insurance, there's public and private sector employers. Now I'm reading from this left-hand side quote. The thing about these that's the thing about these that's important is that they're typically not targeted by labor unions because obviously there was a ban on public sector organizing, so they couldn't get in there without breaking the law. Well, maybe that's more excuse to break the law, but there's consequences to these things, right? High tech is relatively recent. It's only really asserted its dominance maybe like 50 years ago, if you're being generous. The thing that's really important, though, for why there needs to be new independent labor organizations is this part of the quote. Existing unions have much to risk and lose through the purposeful violations of the Taft-Hartley Act, secondary boycotts, shutdowns, sit-down strikes, etc., organizing committees or startup unions, etc., etc. I'll get to the important part. The AFL-CIO could explore the legal and financial avenues for building institutional firewalls for donor unions or for the AFL-CIO itself as a donor organization that would be responsible for providing money, logistical assistance, long-term loan staff, and other help without the expectation of an organizational quid pro quo. So that part about the organizational quid pro quo, that's why these need to be independent labor organizations. They can't just be dependent upon the AFL-CIO or any other big union, right? It's got to be independent so that there's no risk of a quid pro quo. And the AFL-CIO could be, a donor organization. It could be a legal and financial avenue for building institutional firewalls, as mentioned earlier in this quote. It could essentially provide the muscle, whereas the independent labor organizations could, do organizing, right? But anyway, I think that's that for this question. Okay, so how does escalation overcome repression? So escalation basically means you raise your bets, and repression is basically what happens when the employer doesn't want you to go on strike anymore. What they do is they call in the cops or the Pinkerton Detective Agency, or they start threatening to fire you, or they try to bring in new workers, scabs, to break up the strike. They have paid agitators come in to try to rough you up a bit, punch you in the face, maybe fire some plastic or rubber bullets at you or something like that. They're trying to make the strike stop, make you just go back to work and, put your head between your legs and not try to ask for anything anymore. What the workers should do in such a situation is escalation. Escalation, like I said, it's when you raise your bets. So if the employer starts trying to use repressive tactics on you, what you do instead is you increase your demands. You say, oh, we were just asking for better wages. Now we want wages even better than that. Now we want benefits. Now we want not just the people on strike to have better wages, but we want all of the workers in all of the divisions of this business to have better wages. Yeah, just giving us our raises, that's not going to be enough anymore. Another thing you could do to escalate is have more businesses, especially related businesses, go on strike as well, so that it's not just one company and their employees going on strike, but it's a whole bunch of companies, secondary strikes, solidarity strikes, people engaging in sit-ins, people locking the doors and preventing anybody from getting in and getting out, picket lines to stop the buses, or not the buses, the trucks and the trains from bringing in and distributing the goods. All of that is escalation. And that is the key to overcoming repression, because what it does is it puts even more pressure on the boss to give you what you want. So next, in the 70s, there was a lot of emphasis on reforming unions and building rank and file struggle independent of and in opposition to the labor bureaucrats. Why are today's progressive unionists less inclined to take on labor bureaucrats? Well, I think a big reason why today's progressive unionists are less inclined to take on labor bureaucrats is because of the extreme repression of Marxism in the United States, especially as a result of the Red Scare of the 1980s. Not the first one or the second one, but would this be the third one, I guess? We can take a look at this quote on the left-hand side. Many of these activists put their politics in their pockets, abandoning class struggle unionism in favor of labor liberalism and accommodation with the bureaucracy. There was likely a number of reasons for this. By the early 1980s, most Marxist groups had imploded and many adherents had abandoned class struggle theory. Many of the ex-leftists approached the labor movement on a very practical basis, leaving theory to the law professors and labor liberal staff. On the one hand, this was good because they rejected the sectarian excesses of the 1970s. However, many essentially abandoned class struggle unionism, which is the only hope for the working class. And that last sentence is the reason why progressive unionists of today have abandoned class struggle unionism in favor of labor liberalism. This next quote here says, in part, this can be attributed to the relative weakness of the anti-capitalist left during this period. With the waning of the great social movements of the 1960s and the rise of neoliberal ideas, left-wing and socialist ideas were marginalized within society as a whole, including other social movements. It's not surprising that the labor movement left mirrored the weakness of the left overall. And this is sort of reflective of something we talked about in the last discussion before this one. I believe it was chapter 4 that, or maybe it was chapter 3 that Joe Burns brought up his experience in the 1980s. He ran for a leadership role in a big business union, and he was pulled to the side by one of the officers, and he said to Joe Burns, he said, some folks are saying you're pink, meaning, you know, are you a communist? If you are, then we don't want you here. So that's a huge reason why there's this shift towards like labor liberalism, and why no one in the progressive unionist movement, or if you even want to call it a movement, wants to take on labor bureaucrats. I mean, you could take a look at, for example, the rail worker strike again. The reason why the rank and file workers wanted to do the strike is because they wanted, paid sick leave. But the actual bureaucrats within the labor movement, they didn't want this because they didn't want to risk anything untoward happening in the labor movement. They didn't want to risk a huge confrontation, especially around the holidays, right? Um, they didn't want to risk their relationships to members of Congress or towards other governmental institutions. So they tried to keep this, strike talk more fettered. Um, and I mean, in the case of the recent rail workers strike being broken before it even got off the ground, I think it's obvious that Congress lied to the unions and said, hey, we're going to pass this bill that has paid sick leave in it for you. And then, of course, they didn't pass it. And then they said, oh, it was those nasty Republicans. They voted it down. Well, yeah, of course they voted it down. They're Republicans. Did you think that they might not vote it down? It's like, this doesn't make any sense if you think that everyone's being honest with each other. But if you realize that they're just a bunch of liars, then it makes perfect sense. Oh yeah, I think I spent enough time on this slide. This next slide, the quote says, for decades we have allowed the liberal law professors and the labor education crowd to dominate the discussion of labor strategy. With the increasing receptivity for socialist ideas among younger folk and labor activists, we have new opportunities for discussion of class struggle ideas. It's time for class struggle unionists to take the lead. Labor activists, by definition, are optimists. How else do you motivate people? The problem is, without a realistic estimate of the conditions we face, it's hard to develop a sufficiently radical response. But revolutionary optimism alone isn't enough. Missing are the systematic and withering critiques made by previous generations of labor leftists. So, the general idea is that the left wing, meaning the socialist left wing, was stamped out. And what's left is this sort of, weak, this weak liberal version of, like, it's a bit like a carbon copy, but like a really bad one. one that doesn't work. It doesn't quite capture the power of class struggle unionism. It's like it's like AI art versus the real thing, right? It's just an imitation. It captures it and it takes it as a reference and it makes slight modifications, but it never really creates anything new because it's a computer. Computers can't create new things. There's no way of doing that. No one's figured out how to program that yet. Um, okay, the next question, sorry. What does Burns mean by the militant minority strategy? Um, I mean, this is a play on the silent majority thing that I believe Nixon said about the Republicans. Um, and I'll just read from this quote here on the left side. The concept of the militant minority is pretty simple. Organizers and activists know that normally there is a core of people who most want change in a workplace and a community. A good organizer pulls those folks together and engages the enemy, whether it be the boss or slumlord, and in doing so systematically pulls more and more people into the struggle. Now, to be clear, the key point to the militant minority strategy, as discussed above, is putting the labor movement on a class struggle basis. It's not just an organizing technique, it is fundamentally an oppositional strategy geared towards transforming the labor movement. It was developed by French syndicalists as a way of transforming their conservative unions. It was imported to the United States by William Z. Foster, who later joined the Communist Party. So that's the militant minority. You focus on the core of people that most want a change to occur in a workplace or community. You get those people together. You engage the enemy with that group of people. And when you do that, the popularity of this movement grows, and more people will get pulled into this organization. Even those people that weren't the militant minority, they all get pulled in. You engage the militant minority first, you get them together, and then you pull in the rest afterwards. All right. This question, Burns says labor liberals see themselves as indispensable organizers, whereas class struggle unionists see themselves as fish in the ocean, agitators and oppositionists. Then it says to discuss. So the labor liberals see themselves as indispensable organizers. It's sort of like a self-fulfilling or like a self-congratulatory view that they have of themselves. They have what many young people on the internet, especially Twitter, call main character syndrome. They see themselves as the main character and everything going around them as being like some sort of inspirational movie, especially like a biopic about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or someone like that. Maybe not Malcolm X, more Martin Luther King. But they see themselves as being the main character in these movies, which is just reality. It's not actually a movie, which is where it kind of falls apart because movies have main characters, but reality doesn't. They see that the labor liberals see themselves as indispensable organizers. What that implies is they see themselves as being more important to the labor movement than the laborers, than everybody else around them, right? They see themselves, they're the indisposable ones. The labor liberals see themselves as the indispensable ones. If they didn't come up with these terms at the time, if they had the chance, they probably would have called themselves essential workers 2 years ago. But some of them probably still did. But and then compare that to class struggle unionists. They see themselves as fish in the ocean. That's this bottom image right here. You see the big fish going after all the little fish, and you would think that the big fish is going to eat all the little fish, but then you see this. Nope. The little fish organize, they form a union, and it turns out they're bigger than the big fish. So that's the way that class struggle unionists see themselves. They're the small little tiny fish. They're not the big fish. They're not like the most important of the little fish. They're just one of the little fish, same as everybody else. So that's the big difference between these two ways of viewing themselves. You essentially, what it boils down to is, what is your role? What role do you play in this movement? Are you someone who thinks of themselves as being someone that somebody should make a movie about in the future, or are you just somebody there who's there to help because you want to help, because helping is, morally speaking, the right thing to do? So that's the big difference. And I believe that's the last question. Yes, it is the last question. So that wraps up the third session on class struggle unionism. We have one more after this, which will cover the rest of chapter 6, and we'll also pull in chapter 7 as well, and pretty sure that's it. There's also a conclusion at the end, which we'll cover as well. So chapter 7 is called Class Struggle Strategy. We went over tactics earlier, so now we're going to talk about some strategies, and then the conclusion of the book. You know, we'll hear more from Joe Burns. But yeah, that's it. If you want to read along with us, or you want the book for yourself, it's available at Haymarket Books. It's currently, as I'm recording this, December 14th, so there's probably going to be a holiday sale of all of their books. So get yourself Class Struggle Unionism by Joe Burns. Get yourself Joe Burns' other book, Strike Back. Get, I don't know, anything else from Haymarket. You can get some of the plays that they have, because they don't just have books, they have plays. They have they have short tracts. They have comic books. They got picture books. They got photo albums. They got lots of cool stuff. So I believe that wraps it up for this catch-up video. I will see you in the next one. If you're able to make it to the book club meeting, that would be awesome. You can see more information about the book as well as our future schedule at our website, atldsa.org/book club. I believe that is all I have, so I'm going to end the video now. Take care, solidarity forever, and, you know, that's it. Later, comrades.